From KPFA and the Earth Island Journal, I'm Fiona McLeod, host and producer of today's show. Welcome to Terra Verde. After a dry winter this year in the West, our region is once again facing high fire potential this season. And of course, there are already a number of major wildfires currently burning. I'm going to just jump right in and introduce my guest today, Zeke Lunder, who has worked in wildfire for almost 30 years, including 2 decades as a wildfire mapping specialist and wildfire analyst on many of the largest fires in California history. Zeke has designed and managed wildfire fuels reduction projects and worked as a prescribed fire instructor and burn boss. And you may also know him from his YouTube channel and website called The Lookout, which he started during the Dixie Fire in 2021 to communicate real-time information to the general public about fire behavior, what's happening and why, and what might be coming next. So, Zeke, welcome to Terra Verde, and thank you for joining me today.
Hey, it's great to be on KPFA. I grew up in Berkeley, and we actually listened to KPFA from Lassen County when I was a child via a mountaintop antenna.
Oh, nice. Well, welcome to KPFA. We're so happy to have you. I wonder if you could introduce yourself to our listeners a bit more about your background and some of your reasons for starting the Lookout.
Yeah, my parents met in Berkeley, and I was born there. And then in the end of the 1970s, they moved out to northeastern California. So I grew up in a timber town way out in the sticks, kind of between Mount Lassen and the Nevada border, and started working for the Forest Service in high school. Got a geography degree, and worked for the Forest Service through college on crews that were marking trees for thinning for fire hazard reduction. Got kind of introduced to fire and prescribed fire through that experience, and then I ended up being a contractor on major wildland fires, kind of starting in about 1999. Started my own business to do that kind of work and traveled all over the West making maps on large fires, and became a prescribed burn boss here in Northern California in the past decade. And now I work primarily in fire education through the YouTube channel and as an instructor on prescribed fire training events. And I was inspired to start the channel just because I feel like the media most often gets it wrong when it comes to reporting on wildfire. I have a friend who says that wildfire reporting is kind of a three-legged stool where you have victims and you have heroes, and the fire is always the villain. And I felt like I got tired of trying to help reporters write better stories. So I thought, well, I should just start reporting on fires myself. And so I call upon my experience and on my friends and my mentors to try to tell more nuanced stories about how wildfire operates. Um, it's got a mind of its own, and so we can understand some of the things that it does. But we try to tell stories from a different perspective.
Yeah. From your work and just along that line of fire literacy and understanding fire history of the places that we live in, I wonder if you could share for listeners who might not have seen any of your live streams before, um, what are some of those more nuanced stories that you do tell through your work?
I think oftentimes we don't hear much about the variety of fire effects. We hear usually colorful language that, the fire destroyed 75,000 acres. And I think it's always more accurate to say the fire affected 75,000 acres. The fire burned across 75,000 acres. But during that time, some of that burned at night, some of that burned in the morning when it was damp out, some of that burned when the wind was blowing and it was hot. And so there's a lot of nuance to the ecological effects of fire. And so, for the example of, even the campfire, which was one of the most destructive fires in history, um, we actually got a lot of beneficial ecological effects from that fire in the period after it kind of blew through and destroyed 25,000 homes. We actually got beneficial fire from portions of that, but you'll never hear that. You'll never hear a story really that, oh, there were ecological benefits to the campfire because we're really caught up in that drama of 90 people dying and entire community being wiped off the map.
Right. I want to ask you more about that a little later on here. But maybe just as we're starting our conversation, obviously California has always had fires, but in the last decade or so, we've seen an acceleration of these kind of high impact and destructive fires that you were just mentioning. I think there's also more of an awareness or focus or discourse on how our urban environments were not built to mitigate the inherent risk of fire in a place like California. And I think for many people, probably fueled by the language in the media, as you were just saying, the way that we talk about fire in our society and in our culture. Fire is, and threat of fire is one of people's biggest fears. So I would love to just kind of start our conversation by hearing from you a little bit. What are some of the defining features that you would say, in your own words, characterize our current fire reality?
I think a huge part of the problem is that our urban environments were built without consideration of fire, and they're also built without consideration of how you might manage the vegetation. And so, say in the Berkeley Hills, if you want to remove a tree that's right up against your house, oftentimes it's almost impossible to even get in your backyard if you're on a steep lot down below your deck. And so then you end up having to, rent a crane and pay a tree service, and then maybe you're looking at, ten or $15,000 just for a single tree. And so we talk a lot in general in my business about mitigating fire hazards, about hardening homes and creating a more kind of fire permeable landscape where fire could actually maybe burn through and not destroy all the homes. And in a lot of our neighborhoods and communities, that's just not possible because of the way we've zoned and parceled up the landscape and built upon, really difficult terrain.
Yeah. I'm really interested to hear more from you about kind of along those lines. I think many of the major recent fires that people probably think of when they think of wildfire are ones like the Palisades and Eaton fires, Lahaina, even Paradise, which are ones that have broken out in what is called the urban wildland interface zone. Can you talk about that zone and maybe help just parse out some of the details, what that interface is, and then how fires there behave differently from other forms of major wildfire that you work on?
Yeah. Yeah, so across the country, we've got millions of acres of what we kind of call technically the wildland urban interface, or WUI. And that's just basically where the brush meets the community. And the density of the community and the density of the brush, and there's kind of a lot of different flavors of WUI. And so you have a really extreme examples like, say, Grizzly Peak Road, where you've got houses that stop right at big eucalyptus groves on the other side of the road, versus maybe more rural areas where you've got, scattered homes and oak woodland, like say around Chico in the foothills. Some people live out in the oaks and it's kind of grassy and there's trees and they're still in the wildland urban interface, but maybe it isn't quite as kind of explosive a cocktail as the Oakland Hills. But in general, one of the reasons that homes burn in wildfires is because when we have wildfires that burn into the urban interface, it's really difficult to fight those fires at all. And the homes really just become another kind of fuel type. So, we did a YouTube documentary last year, a 5-part series about the Palisades fires and Eaton fires, where we rode e-bikes from Pasadena and the Eaton fire over to the Palisades fire. And along the way, we rode through Beverly Hills and Beverly Glen and some of the kind of most exclusive neighborhoods in the world, some of the most exclusive real estate, but also some of the kind of uh, most of the videos just us like slapping our foreheads and going, "Oh my God, I can't believe how bad this is." And we called that series Danger in Plain Sight because I think that a lot of people's aesthetic appreciation of what it means to have a California style bungalow, it's like the classic Berkeley bungalow where you've got the beautiful redwood trellis and the 60 or 80-year-old wisteria. And we've got this conception in California of this indoor outdoor living where the landscaping really becomes part of the architecture. And that is actually kind of just about the most dangerous combination of, when you're inviting nature into your house and your kitchen is pouring out into the patio, you're also basically inviting fire into your house because the landscaping, for the most part, will burn when it's dry. And oftentimes we use really flammable plants for landscaping in the urban interface because, you drive around into Berkeley Hills and you see deer. And so a lot of people figured out that if they plant stuff that deer like to eat, then you don't have landscaping. But what we found is that a lot of landscaping plants that are sold as being deer resistant are that way because they are full of pitch and these compounds that plants have evolved to defend themselves against grazing. And so you get rosemary and lavender and juniper and these other really popular, spruce landscaping plants that actually are the worst possible thing you could have growing in your yard just because they burn like turpentine.
That was such a great YouTube series. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in the topic. And I actually wanted to ask you, um, in addition to just kind of studying the landscape architecture and the kind of facts and features that led to these fires last year, what were some of the insights that you all walked away from that experience of studying those landscapes with in terms of like making sensible land use more common in our state and how to make living in a fire-prone area safer?
I think for me, the most mind-blowing thing about riding around Beverly Glen and Beverly Hills and the Palisades was just the that intersection of architecture and landscaping and just how integral landscaping has been in in architecture. And so, and realizing like when we're out riding around these neighborhoods, the only people we see out there are speaking Spanish and doing yard work, landscaping work. And so I guess for me, there's this realization that people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of owning a home in these neighborhoods on landscaping. And that when you think about what else you could do with that money if you weren't spending it on getting your hedge pruned, you could do a lot to, you know, change your fence or change your eave vents and do all these things that we know increase the survivability of your homes. But danger in plain sight was definitely the theme. Like once you have these kind of fire eyeballs and you've seen towns burn down, it's really hard to be happy or to appreciate the beauty of a really beautiful landscape, even though like, man, these places are spectacular, the hedges and everything. It's like, wow, people, this is definitely beautiful art form, but it's kind of ruined when, a lot of us go through these neighborhoods and all we can really see is the chimneys standing after the future fire burns down the community. I think one of my takeaways from looking at places like this is that a lot of those neighborhoods are going to burn down. We're not going to be able to make the change. We're not A lot of places aren't fixable. And so that's like it's kind of hard to stay hopeful in this work when you go from place to place and like watch towns burn down and see how hard it is to really get people to take it seriously. I think a lot of people are paralyzed with this feeling of overwhelm that like, oh, there's nothing I can do. So they don't even start. But I think that for me, the takeaway is that there are a lot of little things you can do that make your house less likely to burn down when there's a fire, and you should do all of them. And if you can't do them all, you should start on the things that you can as soon as possible. And so being in Berkeley, that zone zero discussion about like making sure you don't have flammable materials right up against your house, that's very, very important just to start at your house and look at like what are the things in the first 5 feet out from my house that I can do to improve the survivability. So there's amazing amount of resources out there for people that want to um, make their house more resilient. I think, we have such a wide range of issues around the WUI, and one of them, in less urban area, so Berkeley is kind of at the extreme end of having this incredibly dense, fire-prone, poor access, difficult environment. But then you go out to other places, and the WUI issue might be better framed, like in the Klamath Mountains, as, hey, if I can fireproof my place, it's more likely that the Forest Service is going to let fires burn in the backcountry if they don't feel like that fire could come down and burn my community. So, my friends on the Klamath River are thinking of the WUI in a different sense, and that if you live in the WUI and you care about forests, the more you can do to fireproof your community and also your culture, the more likely you might actually get to let the Forest Service let lightning fires burn in the backcountry. But for now, we are putting out every fire because we know that the communities nearby are not resilient. And if we have an escape, if the fire that we are letting burn for resource benefit comes to town, it's going to burn the whole town down because no one has really taken care of building that fire culture in their community.
Right. I actually wanted to talk a bit about that kind of fire culture and how so much of our current fire reality is shaped by these decades of fire prevention and suppression, and also criminalization of indigenous and cultural fire practices. So I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the shifts that have been happening in fire and land management that have been changing that reality, but then also what shifts maybe aren't happening or not happening fast enough.
There's definitely a shift happening with acceptance of prescribed fire and curiosity about prescribed fire happening in neighborhoods. Here in Butte County, we're burning like right around people's homes. They're doing similar work in Lake County, Humboldt County. So there's great momentum there. I think the thing that still we need to work on is just that the scale of that work is still really small. And so getting major landowners, the big timber companies involved is important because doing a whole bunch of little like 1 acre burns or 5 acre burns isn't really going to cut it. We have to look at like the flammability of the entire landscape. And also we have to get to a point where we can use fire on the landscape again. Uh, these landscapes have been tended by humans using fire since the beginning of time. So that I think connection to place is really important in this. We tend to focus on acres treated or other kind of metrics that look good in a spreadsheet, but like cultivating a culture of tending, I think is really, we're not going to get there without getting to a point where people really are serious about tending the land that they live on for more than just one reason. I think we tend to have a really kind of narrow lens of like fuels management is only to protect my community from wildfire. But I think, at least around where I live, a lot of the work that we've done in the last 30 years that we've kind of branded as fuels management, if we would have thought of it as oak restoration, we would have appealed to a different um, way of thinking. I think this idea of restoring what we want instead of like preventing what we're scared of. Like a lot of our work in vegetation management and fuels management is this real fear-based, like if I don't do this, my house is going to burn down. And if we think about like creating a fire adapted landscape like that's dominated by oaks, and we're like, oh, I'm focused on creating more oaks, which gives me more acorns, which people can eat, which turkeys can eat, which deer can eat, which are really like the foundation of this like whole natural food web. And that we have to really figure out how we can pivot away from this fear-based um, framing of fire towards one that's like, hey, we want the landscape to look like this. Native people have been tending landscape for what they wanted for forever, and so I think we have to think, point positive is what my friend Will Harling says. If you're on a river trip, you don't point at the hole, because then the guy upstream is going to go into the hole, right? So you point like, go over there, go where you want. And so that was the advice my buddy Will gave me is just like, let's point positive. And I think that thinking of tending and restoring and creating what we want versus just trying not to die or like, oh, I have to do this or I can't get insurance, might put us into a better frame of mind around, hey, what is it that we really want, that we really need?
Absolutely. I love that metaphor. And this is maybe a good moment to point to some of those things that you were mentioning earlier, um, the positive benefits of fire. So, can you talk about what happens in an ecosystem after a big wildfire? And if there are specific examples, you mentioned oak restoration, but maybe from some of those more recent big fires.
One thing I'm hearing about now, just like, I think you get these little kind of whispers of like, oh, so and so saw an elk over here. And so like we've got elk in the foothills now in Butte County and Plumas County, where people haven't seen elk for forever. And the deer herds, you see long-term benefits in the number of deer and the size of them. After a fire, a lot of the landscapes that we've lost here in the last 10 years are landscapes that were really heavily encroached by conifers because of a century of fire suppression. And I think a lot of us, our vision of what the forest should look like is shaped by what we've known and what our grandparents have known. But that's not necessarily what the landscape looked like 100 years ago at all. And so post campfire, post park fire, post bear fire here in Butte County, we see a huge amount of regrowth, natural regrowth in the hardwoods. And those are super important for the deer herd. Like the Tehama deer herd used to be one of the biggest ones in the state, and it's really dwindled. And I think in large part because we've kept fire out of these landscapes that just become kind of dominated by old dead brush that the deer can't eat. And so with fire comes this enormous flush of new life, often in the hardwoods. I mean, the hardwoods, their response to fire is to sprout prolifically. That's their ecological response. So all those little sprouts create a ton of food for the deer. I mean, looking at the Dixie, the scale of the scale of the severity is kind of perplexing, where it's like, well, have we had fires that were this big before? Have they been this destructive? And I think that it's hard to use kind of the tools of science to really understand that. But the other positive outcomes, I think, after a fire, well, it's just a friend of mine who's a forester, and it seems kind of counterintuitive coming from a forester when they're so used to like thinking that fire is death. He says, fire is actually life, and the absence of fire is death. And so if you have a forest that just stands there for hundreds of years and doesn't have fire, you never get that flush, and you just accumulate all the bones. And someone said like you look at how much kind of slough and bark and everything piles up at the base of a huge old tree. And someone says, "Man, if you stood in the same place for 100 years, there'd be a lot of crap around your feet too." And so the longer we go in these forests without fire, the more likely it's really hard for us to burn old growth because there's so much fuel on the ground that we can kill the roots of the tree. And so the longer the forest goes without fire, the harder it is for humans to use fire and the more destructive the fires are when they come. So often I think we only see the destruction of the fire afterwards. We don't often see that like, well, this fire that we just had killed half the trees, but we had two times more trees than we needed out here. So I think it's hard. It's hard to break through that barrier of focusing on the property and the mudslides and the negative outcomes. I agree. It's hard to weigh that again. How do you weigh the value of someone's home against the value of the baby oaks coming in after the burn? It's really difficult to. They're not really compatible value systems.
Right. Well, I really appreciate how, I mean, that answer right there was a great example of the nuance that you are trying and I think succeeding to bring into these conversations where we're not just looking at this very complex issue from one angle, but rather we're thinking about the historical and the geographic specificity of the place that fire is happening in. So, thank
Yeah,
you for
I
that.
think that's super important what you just said. It's just that we have within California, we have almost as many fire regimes or ways that fire used to interact with the landscape as we do language groups. And California has like when you look at the native languages that we have here, it's like one of the most diverse linguistically in the world. And so you have we call that pyrodiversity. Is all these different ways that fire has occurred. Right now there's this great example of that happening in Big Sur, where the fire's burning up on the top of the ridge above Highway 1, but halfway up that ridge, you've got fog every day.
Right,
And so the fire kind of backs down to the fog and it goes out. And right on the other side of the hill in Ventana, it's basically a desert and the fire's burning through chaparral like nobody's business. But that's all happening within like 1 square mile.
right. Um, I would love to talk a bit about we've talked kind of about more urban or urban wildland interface zone fires, but also I know that you spend a lot of time looking at fires that are happening in less densely populated areas too, like some of the ones that we're seeing in the West right now. But really, rather than focusing specifically on any one fire that's burning at the moment, which people can go to your wonderful YouTube channel for information about all of those things,
Or the website.
or the website. What I'm really curious to hear your perspective on is this year we've also seen some pretty major organizational changes to the Forest Service.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you can share with our listeners how that may have impacted the fire reality that we're facing either in the short term or maybe looking forward to the long term.
No, can't really. It's too complicated to tease that all apart. I think everyone wants to know that. Everyone wants to know, like, did Doge cuts affect our fire readiness, our fire resilience? And I think it's too hard to tease that out specifically. I think the consolidation of the fire agencies is a good thing, in my opinion. I do think that we should have a national kind of coordinated fire agency rather than having like five, six, seven different federal agencies
Mhm.
that coordinate firefighting. Uh, I think I have concerns about how forest management and the intersection there of good fire and fire for land use will get sorted out in that process. But I think it's like I said, it's hard to tease out like specific policy direction. I'd say the general policy, the general attitude towards federal workers is one of great contempt right now, and that's not helpful. And
Right.
it doesn't make people want to keep working there. But I think it's hard to say like if people who are leaving right now, if they're leaving because of that, or if they're leaving, there's a lot of other problems that federal firefighters face. And the kind of recent attitude is kind of just one of the many, but we don't do a good job of taking care of our federal firefighters. And so it's hard for me to say like they left because of Elon Musk versus they left because they couldn't afford housing and their mental health was shot and their expectations on them of how much they would work versus be at home was unrealistic.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing all of those realities that many of the people who fight fires in our country face to this
Yeah, a
conversation.
lot of my friends who've been hotshots, like they lived in their cars because they couldn't afford to pay rent in a mountain community where they were based.
Yeah. We just have about a minute left here, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to share with your listeners that I haven't noted yet.
I think I'd just like to share that forest policy and fire management, they're all very complicated and nuanced. And I feel like the national environmental organizations over the past 50 years have done a really terrible job around messaging on forestry and messaging on fire policy. And I know that a lot of them want to get it right, but these kind of one size fits all um, policy kind of prescriptions or like, let's stop all federal logging on, you know, let's stop the whole federal timber sale program. Like those, I don't feel like have served to really improve the conditions in the forests. And so we have to be patient and take time to learn the specifics of the ecology of every specific part of the land if we're talking about it. You know, I feel like California Chaparral Institute has some perspectives on cutting brush and fuel breaks that really make sense in Southern California. Good ecological arguments against it. But then do we have other places where, cutting forests for fire management purposes might actually make sense. And so having these kind of like blanket prescriptions or kind of philosophical leanings towards active management of the forest, like you have to really learn about the place you're talking about and not just say like, oh, I heard this and so it applies everywhere.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We are unfortunately out of time for today. I've been speaking with Zeke Lunder, and you can find his live stream on YouTube or on thelookout.org. Like I said, I highly recommend all of our listeners go check out the website for so much of this nuanced and geographically specific fire information that Zeke was just sharing about. Zeke, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Great. Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
As always, thank you to our listeners. Terra Verde is co-produced by KPFA and the Earth Island Journal. You can find all of our episodes at KPFA on the online archive or on the Earth Island Journal podcast page.
Hi, I'm Roddy Kill. I help keep KPFA's daily broadcast schedule running smoothly. And as the afternoon board operator, I bring shows like Flashpoints to your speakers. As much as I contribute, none of it happens without listener support. Right now, we need your help. If KPFA means something to you, please donate today at kpfa.org. You, and only you, keep independent radio alive.
This is Cory Doctorow, author of many books, including Injectification, Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. And you're listening to KPFA 94.1 FM, independent, community-powered radio from Berkeley.
You're listening to the tiny but strong as an ox 94.1 KPFA in Berkeley, 89.3 KPFA in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.